Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Last time we were looking at Michael Jordan,
Yeah.
right? Michael Jordan, from failure to unstoppable success. That was a fun one.
It was really interesting.
But today, we're tackling something a little bit different, something you guys have been asking for, overcoming fear of failure.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah, and you guys sent in some really fascinating articles and research, and I'm really excited to kind of dig into this with you today.
Yeah, I was looking through everything that you sent, and, one thing that really jumped out at me was this idea of really understanding where this fear comes from in the first place.
Right. Yeah, like what's at the root of it?
Yeah, it's not always as simple as it seems.
So what are some of the things you found? Where does this fear come from?
Well, one of the articles talked about how society kind of conditions us.
Yeah.
We're taught to see failure as this, terrible thing.
Right. Like you're a failure
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a reflection of who we are as people.
instead of just like a step in the process,
Exactly. It's like we should be avoiding it at all costs.
which makes it even scarier when it does happen.
Oh yeah, for sure. And then another study that you sent over talked about how our past experiences really shake this fear.
Okay, so even if it's like little things that happened when we were kids.
Yeah, like even small failures can have this lasting impact on how we view failure as adults.
That's so interesting. I mean, so we kind of see where this fear comes from, like this societal pressure and these past experiences. But what do we do about it? How do we actually start to like overcome this fear?
Well, one of the things that kept coming up in a lot of the research was this idea of reframing how we think about failure.
Okay, so instead of being afraid of it,
Yeah, what is instead of seeing it as a setback, we saw it as valuable feedback.
like almost like a learning opportunity.
Exactly. Like you're on this path and maybe you take a little detour, but it helps you course correct.
So it's more about being curious about it than afraid of it.
Exactly. And then another really important point that was brought up was setting realistic expectations. We can't be perfect all the time.
Yeah, I definitely struggle with that one, like being a perfectionist.
Yeah, me too. And it can be totally paralyzing. So focusing on progress over perfection.
That's huge.
It can really help to free us from that fear.
There were a lot of the sources talking about self-compassion too, like being kind to ourselves.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's so important. One article even suggested making a failure resume.
A failure resume, what is that?
So it's basically you write down all the times you've messed up.
Like all your failures?
Yeah, and then you look at each one and think about what you learned from it.
Okay, so you're really like owning those failures.
Yeah, exactly. It's embracing the fact that we're not perfect and celebrating what we learn along the way.
Wow, so we've learned a lot today about the fear of failure, where it comes from reframing our thinking, setting realistic expectations, and self-compassion.
Yeah.
So what do you think is like the one thing that our listeners should take away from all of this?
That's a good question. I think the biggest takeaway is that this fear of failure that we all feel, it doesn't have to control us. We can actually use it to help us grow.
So it's not about getting rid of the fear altogether.
No, not necessarily. It's about understanding it and using it as a tool.
To become stronger and more resilient.
Exactly. And, as you're thinking about all this, here's a question to kind of leave you with. What if embracing failure is the key to unlocking your greatest potential?
That's something to think about.
Yeah.
And listener, we hope this deep dive is giving you some things to think about and maybe even try out in your own life as you work to overcome your fear of failure. That feeling you get,
Yeah.
when you're about to try something new and it's like, what if I mess this up? What if I fail? I think we all get that, and that's what we're diving into today. We're really going to try to get at that fear and maybe even turn it into something good. And we've got some really interesting research and stories here, and they all kind of point to the same idea. It's not really failure itself that's the problem. It's how we react to it.
Yeah. It's almost like we're wired to see failure as this monster, right? Something to be avoided no matter what. But what if we could kind of change that wiring? What if we could learn to see those setbacks not as the end of the world, but as stepping stones?
I like that, stepping stones.
Yeah.
And that's what we're gonna break down today. And we've got some amazing stories of people who did just that. Like J.K. Rowling, think about it. She got rejected tons of times before Harry Potter became, well, Harry Potter, right?
Right.
Or Thomas Edison. Every time his experiment failed, he saw it as just getting closer to that perfect light bulb.
Yeah, and it's amazing to see how their stories really show how powerful it can be to just change your perspective. Instead of being totally afraid of failing, they used each setback as a chance to learn and change direction.
So how do we actually do that? How do we rewire our brains to see failure as feedback instead of like a dead end?
Well, one of the most powerful things, and this comes up a lot in what we've been looking at, one of the most powerful things is to start with setting small goals, goals that you can actually achieve. Instead of focusing on like this giant mountain of success, just break it down into smaller hills, you know? You can climb those one step at a time.
So instead of saying I want to write a bestseller, I might say I'm going to write for 30 minutes every day. Is that kind of what you mean?
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And every time you reach one of those smaller goals, it reinforces that feeling of accomplishment and it builds your confidence. And then you can tackle the next one. And it creates this momentum, keeps you going, even when things get tough.
Yeah. It's like those small wins.
Yeah.
They're proof that you can actually do it, that you can overcome stuff and keep moving forward.
Right.
And I imagine that kind of positive, that self-reinforcement, it can really help with that fear of failure.
Definitely. And you know, talking about self-talk, that's another big part of changing how we react to setbacks. We tend to have this inner critic, right? That
Right.
just bombards us with negativity. It tells us we're not good enough, that we're going to fail, that we should just give up.
Oh, I know that voice. It can be so mean. It's just waiting for you to trip up so it can be like, see, I told you so.
Yeah. And the important thing is to see that voice for what it is. It's just a fear-based thought pattern. It doesn't actually reflect reality. We need to learn to challenge those thoughts and replace them with something more positive and compassionate.
Okay, so how do we actually quiet that inner critic? What can we do?
One really good strategy is to practice mindful self-compassion. When you start to get into that self-criticism spiral, just stop for a second and ask yourself, would I talk to a friend this way?
Wow. That's a good question. I think a lot of us are way harder on ourselves than we would ever be on someone we care about.
Exactly. And that's where self-compassion comes in. It's about understanding that we're all human, we all make mistakes, and those mistakes, those setbacks, they don't define us.
It's like we're giving ourselves permission to be imperfect, to learn and grow without beating ourselves up for it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And when we treat ourselves with that kindness, we can handle the tough stuff much better. We start to see those setbacks not as personal failures, but as opportunities to learn and grow. And that's really where this whole idea of like reframing failure comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's not about pretending that setbacks don't hurt, but it's about shifting your attention to what you can learn from them, you know?
Yeah, like that saying, every master was once a disaster. Like even the most successful people you can think of, they've all had failures along the way.
Right?
But instead of letting those failures define them, they use them as like fuel, to keep going.
Exactly. And one of the biggest takeaways from everything we've looked at is that the most successful people aren't the ones who never fail at all. It's the ones who are able to bounce back, you know?
So it's not about being perfect. It's about having the courage to get back up and try again, even when things are rough.
Right. And that's where the idea of calculated risks comes in, like pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, but in a way that you can manage, you know?
Yeah, that's important because I think a lot of people, when they hear take risks, they think they have to do something drastic or something that changes their whole life, but it doesn't have to be that big, right?
No, not at all. It could be something as simple as speaking up in a meeting when you normally wouldn't, or volunteering for a project that's a little outside of your comfort zone, you know? The key is to choose something that feels a bit scary, but not completely terrifying.
So it's about kind of stretching your comfort zone little by little, proving to yourself that you can handle some discomfort without falling apart.
Exactly. And each time you do that, you build your confidence and it makes you more willing to take on bigger challenges in the future. It's like you're training your brain to see risk not as a threat, but as a chance to grow.
And I imagine that shift in perspective can be really freeing, especially for people who have been held back by fear,
Yeah,
for a long time.
definitely. And speaking of feeling held back, it's important to remember that fear of failure, it often comes from outside sources too, right? Things like our upbringing or pressure from society or even the stuff we see in the media, all those things can make us feel like we're not good enough or that we're not allowed to make mistakes.
It's like we absorb all those expectations and then we start to believe them even when they don't help us at all.
Exactly. And that's why self-compassion is so important. It's about recognizing that we're all deserving of kindness and understanding no matter what we achieve or, what setbacks we face. It's about giving ourselves permission to be human, to learn and grow at our own pace.
Yeah, it's like treating ourselves with the same grace we would give to a friend who is struggling. You wouldn't judge them harshly for making a mistake, right? You'd offer them support and encouragement.
Exactly. And we deserve that same level of compassion from ourselves.
That's such an important message, I think, especially in a world that often focuses on being perfect and doesn't really value the journey.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that embracing failure doesn't mean giving up on your goals or, just settling. It's about recognizing that setbacks are going to happen and they can actually make you stronger and more resilient over time.
It sounds like what we're really talking about is developing a growth mindset. It's about believing that you can always learn and improve no matter where you're starting from.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it reminds me of something else we saw in the research: the importance of surrounding yourself with people who support you, people who believe in you and encourage you to take risks.
Yeah, it's like having a cheerleading squad right there to celebrate your wins and help you up when you fall.
Exactly. And just as importantly, it's about maybe distancing yourself from people who are always negative or critical, because those voices, whether they're coming from inside or outside, can really hold you back.
So it's about creating a space where you feel safe to try new things, to make mistakes, and to learn without being judged. That's really powerful, especially when you're trying to get over that fear of failure.
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
when you have that support, it's so much easier to take those risks, to push yourself, and to see those setbacks as opportunities for growth.
This has been such an interesting deep dive. It's really made me rethink my own ideas about failure, and I bet our listeners are feeling the same way. We'll be right back after a quick break to finish up this conversation and leave you with some final thoughts on how to use failure to your advantage.
Welcome back. We've been talking about reframing failure and turning it into something positive, using it to our advantage.
It really is. It's interesting, right? We try so hard to avoid failing when really it can teach us so much. Makes me think about when kids are learning how to walk. We don't get upset when they fall down, do we? We encourage them to try again, to keep practicing, and eventually they get it.
Yeah. That's a great way to think about it, but it seems like somewhere along the way we kind of lose that willingness to experiment, that playfulness. We start to be afraid of failing, and it stops us from trying new things. It stops us from really, really reaching our full potential.
So how do we get back to that? How do we get back to that curiosity, that willingness to try things out? How do we create that kind of space where it's okay to fail and we see it as a stepping stone and not like a roadblock?
I think it starts with understanding that everyone fails. Everyone makes mistakes. Even the most successful people, they've all faced setbacks. It's not about whether you fail, it's about how you react to it, what you do next.
So when things don't go the way we hoped, instead of blaming ourselves, we could look at it as an opportunity to learn, to grow.
Exactly. And even changing the way we talk about it can be really powerful. Instead of saying, I failed, you could say, okay, so this didn't quite work out the way I planned, but I learned something from it.
Right. It's like we're taking the power away from the word failure by turning it into feedback. It's not about whether we're good enough or not. It's just information. Like, okay, this is what happened. Maybe I need to try a different approach.
Yeah. And just that little shift in perspective can make a huge difference in how quickly you bounce back from setbacks, how you keep moving forward.
So as we wrap this up, as we finish our deep dive into overcoming this fear of failure, what is the one thing you really hope people take away from this?
Embrace the journey. Embrace, all the little hiccups and the unexpected turns. Don't let the fear of messing up stop you from going after what you're passionate about. Don't let it stop you from taking risks, because those risks, those are the things that can lead to amazing growth.
That's really well said. And remember, everyone's on this journey. Everyone stumbles, everyone falls. It's getting back up that matters. That's what really defines us.
And who knows, right? On the other side of that fear, there could be something amazing waiting. Once you embrace that failure as part of the process, the possibilities, they really are endless.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into fear and resilience. We hope you've learned something that you can use to face your own challenges with more confidence and courage. Remember to be kind to yourself, celebrate what you accomplish, and never, never stop learning. Until next time, keep diving deep.